And now it is time to remove that paper texture background. This step is crucial since we're going to be moving each element around on its own and piecing them together into a seamless pattern. If the paper texture were in place for this, it just simply would not work. Do you see what I mean here? This is why it is super important to remove that original paper texture background. Later on, we'll put a fresh new background in its place. That new paper texture is going to be on its own individual layer, so we'll be able to move our elements around without that paper texture moving as well. It'll stay in place the whole time. I like having these watercolor paper texture backgrounds behind my watercolor paintings. This helps watercolors feel a little bit more grounded, plus it's a nice little nod back to your original medium, which was painting these elements by hand. Alright, so I've opened up Photoshop and it's looking like this. I went ahead and reset all of my essentials so that you're going to see the exact same thing I'm seeing. So if at any point your preferences are looking a little different from mine and you're getting lost, I'm going to show you how to reset your essentials so that we're all on the same page. So up here in your main menu, you can tap Photoshop, Preferences, General, and then go down here to this option where it says Reset Preferences on Quit. Click it, press OK, and OK. And now what you can do is quit Photoshop, reopen it, and then you'll be seeing the exact same thing that I'm seeing on my screen because we will both be at that starting page. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is actually come over here to my desktop, and you can see these two scans that I did of my paintings. I'm going to go ahead and start a new folder on my desktop and call it the title of this artwork. So I have a lot of different floral designs and I want to make sure that I'm keeping them distinctly different from the others. So I'm going to call this one Sweet Florals. So I'm going to title this folder name Sweet Florals. I always want to make sure that my folders match the name of the design. And now I can go ahead, click and drag my scans and put them in my Sweet Florals folder. And now everything is going to be contained in the same place. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead, select both of my scans, and open them up in Photoshop. And now you can see that both scans are in two separate tabs up here in Photoshop. And the first thing I'm going to do is combine them into the same document, so when I remove that paper background, it's removing from both scans at once. So to do that, I'm just going to go over here, select one of my tabs, click, and pull it apart. And now I have this document separate from the one beneath it. And then I'll use my pointer tool, which is V on my keyboard. You can also go over here to your menu and select V as your move tool. So with that selected, I'm just going to click anywhere on my canvas and drag it into my other document. Now I can go back to that first tab, click to close it since I don't need it any longer. So now I only have one tab open and it's got two layers over here. You can always toggle on and off these eyeballs to change the visibility of your layers. So the layer I dragged on top is up here, it's called layer 1, and that original layer is just called background. So I'm going to turn on layer 1, again press V to make sure my move tool is selected, and I'm just going to click and drag this off to the side. Then press C to get to my crop tool. You can also get there over here on your menu bar, click and hold, and make sure that this crop tool is selected. If you take a look up here at the upper menu, you'll see that there's no ratio selected. That's great, that's the exact way I want to keep it. And now I can just click on the side, pull that crop over, and make sure that I'm grabbing the rest of that scan. And now you can press Enter on your keyboard to set that crop. And because I don't like looking at upside down things on my screen, I'm going to go ahead and rotate that other scan so that everything is on the same orientation. So again, that layer is selected. I'm going to go to my transform tool, which is Command T on your keyboard. You can also get there by going to Edit, Transform, Rotate. And now you'll see that your pointer has changed into this curved double-headed arrow. I'm just going to click and drag this around to rotate it. If you hold down Shift on your keyboard, the rotation will snap to these perfect 15-degree increments, which makes it a little bit easier. All right, once it's positioned at the correct orientation, I'll press Enter to set that transformation. So at this point, I have both of my scans together on the same artboard. So I can simply click that first layer, hold down Shift on my keyboard, click the background layer, and hit Command E to merge both of those layers together. And now everything is on one single layer so that when we remove the background, it's happening to both of those scans instead of having to do it twice. And one thing real quick I want to point out, over here on your layers panel, background layers get default locked, which means you can't make adjustments so easily. If your layer is locked, just go ahead and click it once to break that lock and make that layer editable. And before I do anything else, I want to go ahead and save my progress. So, File, Save As. I don't need to show this again since I always save to my computer. And we're already in that Sweet Florals folder, which is awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and change the name of the file to Sweet Florals. Make sure it's a Photoshop format, which means the extension ends in PSD, and press Save. And I don't need to show this again because I always want maximum compatibility. And so now you can see up here at the top tab, the name of that file has changed from whatever the original scan was into sweetflorals.psd or whatever you're titling your artwork. If for whatever reason you're not seeing that name change up here in the tab, go ahead and close it by clicking that X. Go back into your folder, find that file again, and open it again in Photoshop. You absolutely want to make sure that your file name is changed up here in that tab. So when it comes to removing your paper texture background in Photoshop, the first step is going to be defining the white points. This only applies, by the way, if the paper you originally painted on is white. If you did acrylic painting on craft or some sort of darker canvas, you don't need to do this step. But because I paint almost everything on white watercolor paper, I start by defining the white point because sometimes my scans get a little bit darker than the original, so I want to bring it right back to that natural vibrancy of my original painting. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So again, I'm going to click that layer, make sure it's selected, and I'm going to go into my levels, which is Command L on your keyboard. You can also get there by going to Image, Adjustments, Levels. And over here on your levels, you have these 3 eyedroppers. The one we want is over here on the far right. Go ahead and click that, and this is how we sample our white point. So I'm going to zoom into my watercolor, so Command +++++, find a white area on that paper, and simply click once. So very, very slight difference, but what that did is it brightened up the overall composition and it got the whitest areas to be white, which is more natural to the way the original was painted. All right, I'll go ahead and press OK. And then fit my composition to screen, which is Command 0 on your keyboard. So I'll show you the before and after over here in my history. So before I set the white point, it looked like this. After I set the white point, it looked like this. So very, very small changes. The next thing I want to do is select this paper texture so that we can isolate it from the background. So again, I want to make sure my layer is selected. I'm going to duplicate that layer by hitting Command J on my keyboard and then clicking and hiding the visibility of that original layer. We're going to come back to that original layer a little bit later, but for now, I can just go ahead and hide it, and we can focus on this duplicate layer. So to select the background, I'm going to use a tool called Magic Wand. To get there, you can press W on your keyboard, or by going up here to the toolbar, clicking and holding, and making sure the Magic Wand tool is selected. And the last thing I'm going to do is click where it says Contiguous to turn that off. So with Contiguous turned on, if I were to select, let's say, this pink area, it's only going to grab the pinks that are touching each other within a tolerance of 32. If I turn Contiguous off and do the same thing, it's going to select all the pinks on the entire canvas, even though they aren't directly touching each other within that same tolerance of 32. If I were to bring that tolerance up to 99 and select the pinks, you can see a lot more got selected, even the stuff that I don't necessarily want to grab. So I'll hit Command D to go back to where I was, put that tolerance back at 32. That's a pretty good sweet spot. Make sure contiguous is turned off. So with my magic wand selected, I'm just going to click anywhere in the white area to select that paper texture. I can press Z on my keyboard and zoom in, and what I'm looking for is to make sure that all of that white paper texture got selected. I don't care too much that there's some stragglers over here because they're not touching the painting itself. So as long as that paper texture got selected, I'm good to go. If you need to add to your selection, again, pressing W on your keyboard to switch to your magic wand tool, you can press and hold Shift on your keyboard, click, and add to your selection. And I'm going to show you real quick. In here, it grabbed some of the white of the lighter areas of that petal. This is why I actually like painting a little bit darker and not having that white show through, because when stuff like this happens, it just adds an extra step for me. So if you have a lot of white airy areas in your illustration, I'm going to show you how you can remove the paper texture background without cutting into your illustration. So it's probably a good thing this happens. All right, Command 0 to fit to screen. The first thing I'm going to do is invert my selection. You can get there by going to Select, Inverse. And so what that did is instead of having the white background selected, it's inverted the selection so that now it's my illustration that's been selected. Now I'm going to go to Select, Modify, Expand by 1 pixel. I'll zoom in and show you what that looks like. So before I expanded by 1 pixel, it looked like this. And after, it added a little bit more breathing room around our illustration, so we're not cropping off any vital elements. And last but not least, I'm going to go to Select, Modify, Feather by 1 pixel, and press OK. So you can't really tell that anything significant happened, but what the feather does is it adds a very slight blur to the edge of your selection. So without the feather, if I were to cut out the paper texture, it would be a very harsh line, but by feathering it by 1 pixel, it just adds a nice soft blur so it doesn't feel as sharply cut out. And that way, when we put it on a paper texture later, it'll feel a little bit more natural and it'll blend in a bit better. All right, Command 0 to fit to screen. I'm going to go over here, again, making sure that layer is selected, and come back down to the bottom of the Layers panel and click this icon where it says Add Layer Mask. Cool, so this checkered background is Photoshop's way of indicating that this is a transparency. So whenever you see this gray and white checker box, that means that there's nothing there. There's no whiteness, there's no paper background, it is just completely transparent, which is exactly what we want. But remember, over here, we had that area that got selected, and if I zoom in really close, you can see that part of our illustration actually got cut out. You can see these checkered background areas. I don't want that to happen. I want to retain the integrity of my original artwork, so I want to paint that back in, which is why we used the mask. So again, Command 0 to fit to screen. And what I'm going to do is over here on my Layers panel, I want to make sure that this layer is selected. I'm going to go down here to my effects, which is the FX icon, click it, and select Color Overlay. It doesn't really matter what color you have here, as long as you can see a lot of contrast between your elements and the background. And this hasn't just turned all of my elements black. I'm just using it temporarily so that I can very clearly see what's been cut out and what's still there. So let me show you what I mean. I'll tap Z on my keyboard and zoom in, and now I can clearly see the areas that got cut out when we removed that paper texture background. And to illustrate what I mean, you can toggle off and on the visibility of that layer mask and see exactly what it's talking about. So it's really hard to see that those areas got cut out here, but when you turn the color overlay on, it becomes a lot more evident. So I use color overlays as a temporary way for me to really quickly see what got cut out, what's still there, and by the time I finish finessing it, I can go ahead and just remove that color overlay. It's just a temporary tool for me so I can see a little bit better what's happening on my computer. What I want to do is brush back in those areas that got removed when I cut that paper texture background out. So to do that, I'm going to use my brush tool, which is B on my keyboard. You can also get there over here on your toolbar, clicking and holding, and making sure your brush tool is selected. Next up, I'm going to click this little arrow next to the size of my brush, turn the hardness all the way up to 100%, bring the size up a little bit as well, and go back over here to my layers, and I want to make sure not the layer thumbnail, but the mask is what's selected. And now I can press Z on my keyboard, click, drag in, and look for areas that accidentally got removed, like this area right here. So B on my keyboard gets me my brush, and here's a handy little trick. You can use your right bracket and your left bracket on your keyboard to change the size of your brush without having to go over here every single time and manually do it over here on the scroller. It's just a handy little way to quickly change the brush size without having to go back every time to the toolbar. All right, so what I want to do is paint back in those areas that got cut out. And to do that, I want to make sure that my colors over here are white in the foreground and black in the background. If they don't look like this, go ahead and press D on your keyboard, and that will reset to default colors. If you press X on your keyboard, it'll swap out whatever the foreground and background color are. And if you press X again, it'll go back to the way it was before. But by pressing D, it'll go right into your defaults, and you can click and use your brush to fill in those areas that got cut out. So I'm just looking for those white areas within my petals, and that's what I'm going to be painting back in. If I swapped out my foreground and background colors, which again is X on your keyboard, and I paint it in, I would actually be erasing part of the illustration. So if I turn off my color overlay, that's what it looks like. I definitely don't want to do that. So I'll hit Command Z on my keyboard a couple times to get back to where I was before. Remember, you can always turn on and off the visibility of this color overlay. It's just helping us see what's been cut out and what's not. All right, so color overlay is on. I'm gonna hit Command -- a few times and just scroll through on my artboard and make sure that there's no integral areas within the illustration that are getting cut out. I painted pretty dark on that original, so it's looking pretty good. Oh, here's one right here. So again, D on my keyboard to make sure it's default foreground and background colors. I want to make sure that my mask is selected, not the layer itself, but the mask. And I'll press B on my keyboard to get to my brush, and I'll just fill that area in. I definitely lost a lot more on this frontal floral. So again, I'm just filling it in with my brush. I'll zoom in tighter on this one, so Z and pull in. So now you can see when I turn off that color overlay, that area that got cut out before is now back in the illustration. There's no transparent grid showing through my flower petal, which is perfect. All right, color overlay back on, Command -- and B to get to my brush, and I'll finish filling in these areas. Remember, you can use your right bracket to increase the size of your brush and your left bracket to shrink it down. This is one of those times where it's really important to have a clean computer screen. Otherwise, you're trying to erase this part of the illustration and it turns out it's just a piece of dust on your screen. All right, so I'm going through and I'm just looking for areas within the illustration that got cut out that I want to fill back in. For the most part, it's actually looking pretty good. I'm pretty sure this area right here is the pencil marks. Let's see. Yeah, so that's the pencil marks coming through because I didn't erase them all the way, which is why it saves you a lot of digital work if you go ahead and erase very thoroughly on your actual paper. But I'll show you how to get rid of those. So again, my mask is selected. My color overlay is actually disabled so I can see the pencil marks. I'm going to press B to get to my brush, left bracket a few times to shrink it down. And now I'm going to press X on my keyboard to switch my default colors. And now I can simply click and erase out those pencil marks very gently. So if you're removing those pencil marks and you accidentally go in a little too far, that's not the end of the world, and this is why we use the mask instead of just erasing right out of the layer itself. When we have a mask in place, we can paint back in any areas that we accidentally removed. So in this case, I just want to switch my foreground and background colors over here, which again is by pressing X on your keyboard. And then I can use my brush and literally paint back in the area that got removed in the first place. Again, by pressing X and switching my foreground and background colors, I can very delicately now paint out the areas where that paper is. So masks over here just give you more flexibility. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and turn that color overlay back on, and then Command minus, 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 just zoom out a few times, and make sure that I filled in the rest of the areas within my illustration that got cut out. So it looks like I got them all, which is fantastic. But if you're wondering what we're gonna do about all these little bits and stragglers over here that we definitely don't want in our final, this is how you remove those as well. So I could, with my brush selected, go through and manually get rid of all of these, but when you're looking at the entire canvas, that would be a lot of work, so I have a shortcut for you. So over here on my layer, with my color overlay turned on, so my entire layer is black or whatever color you're choosing, I'm going to control click on my layer name. Again, I'm not going to control click on the mask or control click on the layer thumbnail. I want to make sure that I'm hovering over my layer name and then control clicking. And I'm going to go up here to rasterize layer style. And what that did is it flattened the entire layer. So now we can no longer toggle on and off the visibility of that mask since it's all been flattened. And that's exactly why we have our original layer saved underneath with the visibility turned off, because we'll be accessing that in a second. All right, so my layer is completely flattened. It's selected, not the original layer, not no layer, but this layer is selected. I'm gonna go back to my magic wand, which remember is W on your keyboard, or over here on your toolbar, the magic wand tool. And now I'm gonna go turn contiguous back on, click one of my petals so that it's selected, and remember, with contiguous on, it's only selecting the areas that are touching each other. So what I wanna do is hold down Shift on my keyboard and click and select all the other areas of my illustration. And a good way to test to see if all your areas got selected is to hit Command X on your keyboard, which cuts out everything, except I totally forgot the signature. So Command Z to undo, and then I'll press Z on my keyboard, click and drag to get a little bit tighter in so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'll press W on my keyboard to get back to my magic wand, press and hold Shift, and click and grab all the bits of my signature. Cool, Command 0 to fit to screen. And now if I cut it out again, Command X, I can see that all of the important areas of that illustration are now gone, and I left all those little straggler bits and pieces behind, which is exactly what I want to do. So Command Z to put it right back in place, Command 0 to fit back to screen so I can see what I'm doing. And now with everything selected, I'm gonna go over here to my layers panel, turn off the visibility of that black layer, turn on the visibility of my original, click and make sure that my original layer is selected, go to Select, Modify, Feather, 1 pixel, press OK, and go to Edit, Cut. Now we'll go to Edit, Paste Special, Paste in Place, and you can see that your illustration got pasted exactly where it was cut out. So the reason this is so important is now if you go over here to your layers panel, you can go ahead and hit delete on that background layer and select that black layer, hit delete as well, and now you have your illustration with the background perfectly removed. So this is exactly how I remove the background for every single watercolor paper that I scan into my computer. So it seems like there's a lot of steps, but if you keep practicing, you'll get to a point where it just feels very intuitive and you'll just go through all of those steps very seamlessly. For me, it takes about under 5 minutes really to delete that paper texture background because I just go so quickly now. So it's just, step 1, step 2, step 3. So the more you practice it, the better you'll get and you'll feel a lot more comfortable with the process. So now that our elements have been isolated from the background, let's go ahead and save. So Command S will save that file. All right, so those are the steps for removing that paper texture background. I want to point out here that there are actually a lot of different ways for removing the paper texture background in Photoshop. This is just the way that works best for me. If you can't tell, I am very precise about the way that I remove that background, and I want it to feel as smooth and natural as possible. Which is why I spend all of that time feathering by just 1 pixel, repainting in that mask manually, adjusting the white point, all of that very minutely detailed stuff. At the end of the day, I'm making a living by licensing my artwork on a professional level, so that extra attention to detail really matters. It'll probably take you a few tries before you really get into the swing of removing that paper texture background, and that is totally normal. You can rewind this video as much as you need until you feel comfortable with the process. I have definitely bookmarked a lot of videos when I was first getting started with Photoshop and learning the basics. Okay, so now that your elements are completely removed from the background, it's time to prep them into a seamless pattern.